Hey, loser. I'm taking your wife on a wild night out, and I'll satisfy her until morning. You can't say no. The voice was a gravelly sneer, each syllable dripping with arrogance. Mason's head snapped up from the paperwork he had been reviewing. He stared, mouth slightly open, at the man blocking the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded the kind of confidence that came from a life spent breaking rules and getting away with it. Mason struggled to process the intrusion. The man's dark eyes were fixed on him, daring him to react. "Excuse me?" Mason managed, his voice low and unsteady, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You heard me," the man replied, taking a slow, deliberate step inside. "I'm Damien. Your wife and I have plans tonight." Mason rose shakily to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor. "Catalina," he called, confusion lacing his tone. Footsteps echoed above, followed by the click of heels against the hardwood staircase. Catalina appeared at the top of the stairs, her form illuminated by the dim, overhead light. She wore a red dress, one he had bought for their anniversary last year. It hugged her curves, the fabric shimmering with every step. She paused for a moment, her gaze meeting Mason's, and he saw nothing but indifference. "Today's going to be so much fun. I'm leaving, honey," she said, voice light and mocking. "Don't wait up for dinner." For a second, Mason felt paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He watched as Catalina walked down the stairs, every step echoing like a gunshot. When she reached Damien's side, she didn't hesitate. She leaned into him, letting him drape an arm around her waist. The casual intimacy of the gesture made Mason's chest ache. "Catalina, what is this?" His voice cracked. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Catalina sighed, as though bored. "It's not a joke, Mason. Just don't make this harder than it needs to be." Her tone was cold, dismissive. "You can't be serious." Mason took a step forward. "What are you doing?" Damien laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Look at him. Pathetic." He turned to Catalina. "Are we wasting time here?" "No, we're not," Catalina replied, a smile playing on her lips. "I'm ready." "You're not going anywhere," Mason said, his voice rising. Desperation clawed at him. He reached out a trembling hand. "Catalina, we need to talk." "Please." "Don't embarrass yourself," Damien interjected, his grip tightening on Catalina. "She's coming with me. Be a good little boy and stay quiet." Mason's eyes darted between them. Anger boiled beneath the surface, but there was nowhere for it to go. His hands balled into fists, knuckles white. "Catalina," he pleaded, ignoring Damien. "Whatever this is, let's talk. Work through it." Catalina's smile faded. She stared at him, and for a brief second, something flickered in her eyes. Pity? Regret? But it vanished. "Mason, it's over. Just accept it." She turned her back on him, letting Damien guide her out. "No." Mason lunged toward the door, but Damien stepped between them. He shoved Mason backward with surprising force, sending him crashing against the wall. Pain shot through his shoulder. "Stay down, loser," Damien sneered. "This isn't your night." Catalina paused at the threshold. She glanced back, a fleeting moment of hesitation. Mason saw it, clung to it. "Catalina, please," he whispered, breathless from pain and despair. "Don't do this." But she turned away. "Goodbye, Mason." The door slammed shut. Silence descended on the room, heavy and oppressive. Mason struggled to his feet, his body trembling. His mind raced. Had he missed the signs? Were there signs? His heart pounded as he staggered to the window, just in time to see them getting into Damien's sleek black car. Catalina slid into the passenger seat, never glancing back. Damien gave one last mocking wave before speeding off, tires screeching. Mason stood there numb. Everything felt wrong, surreal, like he was trapped in someone else's life. Slowly, he walked back to the dining table. The meal he had prepared, Catalina's favorite, was untouched, now cold. He collapsed into his chair, head in his hands. The reality of what had happened crashed over him, leaving him gasping for breath. He replayed the moment over and over. The cruel words, Catalina's cold smile, Damien's contemptuous laugh. How could this be his life? A sudden wave of nausea hit him. He stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before vomiting. When he looked up, his reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable. Red-rimmed eyes, a pale, haunted face. Anger and grief mixed in a toxic brew. He punched the mirror. The glass shattered, shards scattering across the sink. Blood trickled from his knuckles, but he barely felt it. "I'll make them pay," he whispered to himself. "I'll make them both pay." The promise echoed in the empty room, and for the first time that night, Mason felt something other than despair. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Mason sat in the living room, his gaze fixed on the front door, as if sheer willpower could force it to open and bring everything back to normal. He kept replaying the scene in his mind, Catalina's cold, dismissive smile, Damien's taunting words. A whirlwind of questions spun in his head. Had this really been happening? The weight of disbelief pressed down on him, suffocating. He reached for his phone, desperate for any distraction. His hand trembled as he scrolled through old messages from Catalina. Texts about grocery lists, dinner plans, playful banter, they seemed like relics from another life. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. How did it all go so wrong? The thought barely had time to settle before his phone buzzed, jolting him back to reality. The screen displayed a message from an unknown number. "If you think tonight was bad, brace yourself for what's coming. Your pathetic marriage is done." Mason stared at the words, each one slicing through his remaining composure. He read the message again and again, his hands tightening around the phone until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated attack. A wave of fury surged through him, hot and consuming. He couldn't just sit and wallow in confusion and hurt. He needed answers. Mason grabbed his coat and stormed out of the house, the chill of the night air doing little to cool the rage boiling inside him. He marched down the quiet street, thoughts racing. He needed to know just how deep this betrayal went. Was it a fling? Or was it more? Had their entire marriage been a lie? He clenched his jaw and quickened his pace. He found himself at Derek's apartment, pounding on the door until his friend answered, bleary-eyed and disoriented. "Mason?" "It's 2 in the morning, Derek said, rubbing his eyes. "I need your help," Mason said, his voice strained. Derek stepped aside, concern replacing irritation. "Come in." Mason paced the living room, recounting the events of the evening. Derek listened, his expression growing darker with every word. "That's messed up, man," he said when Mason finished. "But what can we do?" "I need to know everything," Mason said, stopping abruptly. "Who this Damien is, how long this has been going on." "Everything," Derek nodded. "I know someone who can dig up information. It'll take some time, but we'll get what we need." "Time isn't on my side," Mason muttered, but he knew he had no choice. "Do it." Over the next few days, Mason threw himself into gathering evidence. He scoured Catalina's social media, looking for anything he might have missed, hidden messages, unfamiliar faces. He searched their shared bank statements for unexplained charges and receipts. He was relentless. Each piece of information he uncovered felt like a fresh wound. One night, while sifting through Catalina's desk, he found a hidden folder. Inside were photos of her and Damien, smiling, holding hands, kissing. His stomach churned, and he shoved the folder away, unable to look at it anymore. He was about to close the drawer when he noticed a second folder, smaller and worn. He opened it to find a stack of letters from Damien. Each one was filled with arrogance and cruelty, mocking Mason and boasting about the affair. Mason's hands shook as he read them. His phone buzzed again, another message from the same unknown number. "You can't stop this. She's mine now." Fueled by rage, Mason hurled the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the wall. He took deep, ragged breaths, trying to calm the storm within. He couldn't let his emotions control him. He needed a plan. The next day, Derek called with news. "I've got something," he said. "Meet me at the cafe." Mason arrived early, his nerves on edge. Derek slid into the seat across from him, a file in hand. "Damien West," he began. "He's trouble, Mason. Wealthy, manipulative, and used to getting what he wants. He targets married women like it's some kind of sick game." Mason's jaw tightened. "How long?" 6 months, Derek said. That's how long he's been after Catalina. It looks like he's done this before with other women. Mason nodded slowly, absorbing the information. And what happens when he's done with them? Usually he leaves them broken, Derek said grimly. Ruins their lives, then moves on. Mason's hands clenched into fists. Not this time. Be careful, Mason, Derek warned. This guy plays dirty. If you go after him, you need to be ready for whatever he throws your way. I don't care, Mason said, his voice cold and steady. He took everything from me. I'm not letting him get away with it. That night, Mason confronted Catalina. He waited for her in the living room, the letters from Damien spread out on the coffee table. When she walked in, she froze, her eyes darting to the incriminating evidence. We need to talk, Mason said. She crossed her arms, defensive. I don't have anything to say. Oh, I think you do, Mason replied, gesturing to the letters. How long were you going to keep lying to me? Catalina's eyes narrowed. It doesn't matter. It matters to me, Mason shot back. I deserve to know why. Why him? Why any of this? She stared at him for a long moment before sighing. Because you stopped being enough, Mason. We stopped being enough. Damien made me feel alive again. By destroying everything we built? Mason demanded. Is that what makes you feel alive? Catalina's gaze hardened. You wouldn't understand. Try me, Mason said, his voice breaking. I deserve at least that. She shook her head and turned away. I'm done explaining myself to you. As she walked out of the room, Mason felt a crushing sense of finality. But he also felt something else, determination. The betrayal ran deep, but he wasn't finished yet. Damien and Catalina would learn that their actions had consequences. Over the next few days, Mason became a man on a mission. Sleep eluded him as he spent hours piecing together fragments of memories and conversations, scouring every interaction he'd had with Catalina in the past few months for signs he'd missed. The pain of betrayal clung to him like a second skin, but he channeled it, turning despair into cold, focused determination. His first step was their shared phone bill. The itemized list of calls revealed frequent communication with an unfamiliar number, sometimes late at night, sometimes while Mason was at work. His hand shook as he highlighted the dates. That's when she said she was visiting her sister. The thought of how easily Catalina had lied to him made his stomach churn, but there was no time to dwell on it. He jotted down the number and ran a reverse lookup, confirming what he already suspected. It was Damien's. Mason clenched his jaw, suppressing a surge of rage. He needed more. Cold, hard evidence, not just for himself, but for whatever came next. On the third day, Mason met with the private investigator, a wiry man named Carl, in a dingy cafe off Main Street. Carl wore a rumpled suit and had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. This guy, Damien West, Carl said, sliding a file across the table, is bad news. I ran a background check. He's got a pattern, seduces married women, wrecks their lives, and moves on. Always seems to have money to throw around. Looks like he enjoys the thrill. Mason leafed through the file, each page deepening the pit in his stomach. Photos of Damien with different women, court documents hinting at restraining orders, complaints filed and mysteriously dropped. Why haven't the authorities stopped him? Mason asked. Carl shrugged. Power, influence, and knowing how to stay one step ahead. He covers his tracks. And when things get messy, he makes sure the blame falls elsewhere. What about Catalina? Mason pressed, hating how her name felt like venom on his tongue. How deep is she in this? Carl hesitated, a flicker of sympathy crossing his face. Deep enough. She's been with him for months. Based on what I found, she knew exactly who he was. Mason's grip tightened on the file. She chose this. Look, man, Carl said, lowering his voice. You want more dirt? I can get it, but it's risky. Damien's people might notice. Do it, Mason said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Back at home, Mason sat alone in the dark, staring at a photo of their wedding day. Catalina's bright smile mocked him now. Was any of it real? The question haunted him, but he couldn't allow himself to drown in doubt. There was work to do. He tracked down every detail of their shared life that had changed recently, new habits, different clothes, unexplained expenses. The more he looked, the more the pieces fit together. There were dates he now recognized as cover-ups, gifts that weren't meant for him, whispers and laughter that made sense in retrospect. One night, while combing through their finances, Mason found it, a suspicious payment to a luxury hotel. He called the place, posing as Damien, and managed to sweet-talk the concierge. "Yes, Mr. West. You and Ms. Catalina were lovely guests. Would you like us to arrange another weekend getaway?" The confirmation left Mason seething. When Carl called again, his voice was urgent. "Mason, I've got more." They met in the parking lot of an old factory. Carl handed over another envelope. "This is everything, photos, audio recordings. Damien isn't just seducing women. He's manipulating them. Blackmail, coercion. If they try to leave, he destroys them." Mason flipped through the photos, each one more damning than the last. Catalina in Damien's arms. Catalina laughing with him. And then, a recording of their voices, muffled but unmistakable. "Why am?" Damien asked in the recording, voice dripping with contempt. "He's comfortable," Catalina replied, her tone flat. "Predictable." "You're exciting," Damien finished, his smugness evident. "Don't forget that." The recording ended. Mason felt hollow. Comfortable? Predictable? After everything they'd been through together? All he'd done to support her? To be there for her? He shoved the envelope away, bile rising in his throat. Carl's hand landed on his shoulder. "Whatever you're planning, be careful." "I'm not planning anything," Mason lied. He met Carl's gaze, his eyes cold. "I'm taking my life back." The following day, Mason tracked Damien's movements. He wanted to see the man up close, to understand what kind of monster could wreak such havoc without remorse. He followed him to an upscale bar, blending into the crowd. Damien exuded confidence, chatting with a circle of admirers, his laughter loud and grating. Mason watched, fists clenched at his sides. He imagined confronting Damien, smashing that smug expression off his face. But this wasn't the time. Revenge would come, but it had to be precise. Controlled. Back home, Mason found Catalina waiting for him, a forced smile on her lips. "We need to talk," she said, as if nothing had happened. Mason stared at her, a million thoughts racing through his mind. "Do you even feel guilty?" He wanted to scream, but he kept his voice level. "Talk? Sure. Let's talk." She hesitated, sensing the shift in him. I know you're upset. Things have been tense. You think?" Mason said, his tone biting. "Was that before or after you decided to throw our marriage away?" Her eyes flashed with something, anger, maybe guilt. "You don't understand." "Make me understand," Mason challenged, crossing his arms. Silence stretched between them. Catalina looked away. "I didn't want it to end like this." "But you did want it to end," he said flatly. "Did you enjoy it? Making me feel like a fool?" She didn't answer. That silence told him everything he needed to know. Later that night, as Mason reviewed every scrap of evidence, he made a vow. No mercy, no forgiveness. Whatever Damien and Catalina had done, they would pay. He wasn't just going to take back his life. He was going to make sure they never forgot what they'd done. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" Derek asked, his tone serious. They stood in Mason's garage, the air thick with tension. Old tools and dust-covered boxes were scattered around, relics of simpler days. Derek's eyes searched Mason's face, hoping to find a hint of doubt, a sliver of the man he once knew. Mason tightened the grip on the coffee mug in his hands. "Yes," he said, his voice low and unwavering. "Then I'll get to walk away, Derek." "Not after everything." Derek shifted uncomfortably. "Revenge is dangerous, Mason. It'll chew you up from the inside." "Let it," Mason snapped. His gaze was hard cold. "I'm past saving." Derek sighed but nodded. "All right. What do you need from me?" Mason took a deep breath and laid out the plan. "Damien's empire isn't as clean as it looks. I found evidence of illegal dealings, money laundering, fraud, backdoor deals with dangerous people. He's careful, but not perfect. Where'd you find all this?" Derek asked, eyebrows raised. "A lot of digging," Mason said. "Some of it was in plain sight, but most of it, let's just say Damien isn't as smart as he thinks." Derek nodded slowly. "So, you're going to expose him?" "Not just that," Mason replied. "I'm going to rip apart everything he's built, piece by piece. Mason moved with precision. Over the next few days, he made calls to anonymous tip lines, whispered information into the right ears, and leaked documents to journalists eager for a story. The first cracks appeared when the media picked up the scent. A reputable news outlet published an exposé on Damien's business practices. The article detailed allegations of embezzlement, unethical practices, and corruption. It was just enough to catch the attention of the authorities, who launched a preliminary investigation. Mason followed the news closely. He watched footage of Damien brushing past reporters, his jaw clenched as he ignored shouted questions. The man's confidence seemed shaken for the first time. One evening, Derek called. "It's working, Mason." Damien's scrambling. "Word is his investors are pulling out." "Good," Mason said, his voice flat. "This is just the beginning." While dismantling Damien's empire, Mason turned his focus back to Catalina. She had become a shell of herself, avoiding him whenever possible. Gone was the woman who had once laughed with him, who had shared hopes and dreams. In her place was someone he barely recognized, a liar, a traitor. But Mason knew there was no point in wallowing. He needed answers. One night, he found her sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of tea. "Was it worth it?" Mason asked, stepping into the room. Catalina flinched at the sound of his voice. "Mason!" He crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. Throwing away years of marriage for a thrill? For him. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "You wouldn't understand. Try me," he said, his voice icy. "Explain why you destroyed everything." Catalina looked away, her fingers trembling around the cup. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "What was it supposed to be then?" Mason demanded, his voice rising. "Fun? An escape? Tell me." "Catalina." She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. "Damien, you made me feel alive. You were distant, distracted. We were drifting apart, Mason." Mason shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. "So you decided to burn everything down?" "Don't put this all on me," Catalina shot back, her voice trembling with anger and shame. "You weren't there, Mason. You were obsessed with work, with everything except us. And that justifies betrayal?" He countered. "You chose him over everything we built." Tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "I made a mistake." "No," Mason said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. This was a choice. Every time you met him, every time you lied, it was a choice." "Mason, please," Catalina whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this," he said, taking a step closer. "Sorry doesn't erase what you did." Catalina's shoulders sagged, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. "I know. You'll know what true regret feels like soon enough," Mason said, his voice low and full of menace. "Trust me." The next morning, Mason met with Carl, who handed him a new dossier. "Damien's desperate," Carl said. "He's trying to cover his tracks. But he's making mistakes." Mason flipped through the pages, taking in every detail. "Perfect. What's next?" Carl asked. "Time to let him feel the walls closing in," Mason said. He leaked more documents, this time implicating Damien in a scandal that reached higher than anyone expected. Corrupt officials were dragged into the mess, and Damien's allies began to abandon him. Mason watched from afar as the empire Damien had built started to crumble. But he wasn't done. One night, Mason returned home to find Catalina waiting for him in the living room. "Mason," she said, her voice raw. "Can we talk?" He didn't answer, just stared at her, his expression unreadable. "I know you hate me," she said. "I hate myself too." "I don't care how you feel," Mason replied coldly. "I just want to know why you think I should even listen." "Because I want to make it right," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know I regret it. I wish I could take it back." Mason stepped closer, his eyes blazing. "You regret getting caught?" "No," she insisted. "I regret everything. Hurting you. Losing what we had." He shook his head. "It's too late. Isn't there anything I can do?" she pleaded. Mason paused, a bitter smile playing at his lips. "No, but you'll find out what it means to lose everything." As he turned and walked away, Catalina crumpled to the floor, sobs racking her body. Mason didn't look back. Outside, Mason felt the cold night air on his skin. He knew his revenge wasn't complete, but he was getting closer. Damien and Catalina would learn what it meant to take everything from him. This was just the setup, the beginning of the end. It happened swiftly. Damien's empire, once powerful and untouchable, began to crumble like a house of cards. The first blow came with the freezing of his assets. Bank accounts were locked, properties seized. He stormed into his office, fury written across his face as he slammed doors and barked orders at his staff. His lawyers scrambled, trying to understand who had gotten to them and how. But every legal maneuver was met with silence. They were up against an invisible force, one step ahead at every turn. In the shadows, Mason watched. Each newscast and report of Damien's fall was confirmation of his success. He sat alone in his dimly lit living room, sipping whiskey as news anchors discussed the scandal surrounding Damien West. A smile tugged at his lips as they speculated about his next move. There would be none. The trap was set. Damien was already finished. As the weeks passed, Damien became desperate. Business partners who once toasted to his success now avoided his calls. Deals fell through. Investors withdrew. The whispers of betrayal and scandal spread quickly, poisoning any chance he had at rebuilding. Mason relished every moment. He wasn't just watching Damien lose his empire. He was the one lighting the match. One evening, Mason received a call from Carl. "Damien's losing it," Carl said, his voice steady but edged with tension. "He's been seen meeting with some questionable people. Looks like he's trying to buy protection." "Desperation makes people reckless," Mason replied. "That's when they make mistakes. What's your next move?" Carl asked. "Let him bury himself," Mason said calmly. "The more desperate he gets, the deeper he'll dig." Damien, cornered and paranoid, began to lash out at anyone he perceived as a threat. Employees were fired without cause. Allies were accused of betrayal, and rumors circulated about his growing instability. One night, as Damien paced his penthouse, a trusted associate finally turned on him. "You've lost it, Damien," the man said, stepping back as Damien's rage flared. "You're dragging all of us down with you. You're just like the rest." Damien shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Cowards! Traitors!" The associate shook his head and walked out, leaving Damien alone. He threw a glass at the door, shattering it into countless pieces, much like his once impenetrable reputation. Meanwhile, Mason turned his focus to Catalina. The affair wasn't just an isolated betrayal. It was a dagger that had ripped apart their life. He wanted everyone to know the truth. He started with their closest friends, sharing evidence of her infidelity. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. He let the facts speak for themselves. Text messages, photos, receipts. When the whispers started, Catalina tried to ignore them. When friends stopped calling, she dismissed it as coincidence. But soon, the reality became undeniable. At a neighborhood gathering, a group she'd once been at the center of, people whispered and looked away. The hostess offered her a thin smile. "Maybe another time, Catalina." On the way home, she fought back tears. "It's just a phase," she told herself. But as days turned into weeks, doors closed wherever she went. At the supermarket, mothers she used to chat with turned away. At the gym, no one made eye contact. The whispers grew louder. Her isolation was complete. Mason's next move was public. He posted a carefully worded message online, outlining the betrayal, stripping away the secrecy she'd relied on. Catalina's social media exploded with comments, some sympathetic, many harsh. She stopped leaving the house. One rainy evening, Catalina showed up at Mason's doorstep. Her clothes were soaked, her hair plastered to her face. She looked like a shadow of the confident woman who'd walked out the door weeks ago. "Mason," she said, voice raw. "I need to talk." He regarded her with icy detachment, arms crossed over his chest. "There's nothing left to say." "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "You've made your point. I've lost everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but—" "Stop," he said, his tone cold. "You think this is about punishment? This is about justice." "Justice," she repeated, incredulity mixed with desperation. "This is revenge, Mason. Pure and simple." "Call what you want," he replied. "You earned this." She stepped closer, dropping to her knees. "I made a mistake," she whispered. Tears streamed down her face. "I was selfish and stupid. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I can't. I can't keep living like this." "You should have thought about that before you chose him," Mason said. "Before you laughed in my face and walked out the door." She sobbed, her hands clinging to the hem of his jeans. "I'll do anything. Please." He looked down at her, the woman he'd once loved, reduced to this. There was no satisfaction in it, only emptiness. "Get up," he said, stepping back. She tried to hold on, but he pulled away. "This doesn't change anything. We're done." Catalina collapsed, her sobs echoing through the hallway. Mason closed the door, the sound reverberating in the silence. He leaned against it, eyes closed, willing the guilt and pain to stay buried. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? To make her understand the depths of her betrayal? The next day, Damien made one last desperate move. Mason got the news from Carl. Damien had tried to blackmail a powerful associate to regain his standing. It backfired spectacularly. Within hours, law enforcement raided his office, confiscating files, computers, everything. The media had a field day. Mason watched the footage without emotion. Damien's smug facade was gone. In its place was a man broken, desperate, defeated. Just like Mason had planned. Catalina tried to reach out one final time. She left messages pleading, apologizing. "I've lost everything, Mason. You were right. Please just talk to me." He never called back. Mason sat in the quiet of his home, staring at the ashes of the life they'd built together. Revenge had been sweet, but it hadn't made him whole. Still, he knew one thing. He would rebuild stronger. And for Damien and Catalina, this was only the beginning of their fall. The morning after Damien's final fall, Mason stood by the window, sipping his coffee. The sun was beginning to rise, casting light over a city that continued its rhythm, indifferent to the chaos he had unleashed and endured. He set down the mug and rubbed his temples. For months, every moment had been driven by revenge. Now that it was over, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. "Freedom," he murmured, testing the word. It felt foreign. He started by pouring himself into work. Late nights, early mornings, anything to keep his mind occupied. The team at the office noticed the shift. His work ethic had always been strong, but now there was an edge to it. He demanded excellence and refused to tolerate mediocrity. Some whispered that Mason was trying to outrun his past, but he didn't care. He needed to rebuild himself, and that required focus. A week later, Derek dropped by Mason's apartment with a six-pack of beer. "You've been ghosting me," Derek said, plopping down on the couch uninvited. He cracked open a can and handed one to Mason. "Thought we should catch up. You know, since you're apparently a workaholic now." Mason took the beer, though he barely tasted it. "I've been busy." "No kidding." Derek took a long sip. "So, Damien's finished. Catalina's, well, you know, now what?" Mason stared at the wall, the question echoing in his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "For so long, revenge was everything. Now it's over. You could try living again," Derek said, leaning back. "Might be nice." Mason shook his head, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "Is that what you came here for? To lecture me?" "No," Derek said. "I came to drag you out of this place. There's a charity event downtown. Thought you might like a distraction." Mason hesitated, but Derek wasn't one to take no for an answer. Hours later, he found himself in a grand ballroom, surrounded by people dressed in elegant suits and gowns. The clinking of glasses, soft music, and hum of conversation filled the air. It felt surreal. As Mason wandered through the crowd, he tried to tune out the noise. He wasn't here to socialize, but as he turned a corner, he accidentally bumped into someone. "Whoa," she said, stumbling slightly. "Careful there." Mason reached out instinctively, steadying her. "I'm sorry," he said, stepping back. The woman had kind eyes and an easy smile that disarmed him immediately. "It's okay," she said, brushing off the encounter with a light laugh. "These things are like obstacle courses sometimes." Mason nodded, feeling awkward. He hadn't expected to engage with anyone, let alone someone who looked so at ease in a place like this. "I'm Mason." "Sophie," she replied, extending her hand. They shook hands, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then she tilted her head. "You don't seem like you want to be here, Mason. Am I that obvious?" he asked. "Only a little." Sophie smiled again. "Why'd you come?" "A friend dragged me out," he admitted, glancing over at Derek, who was now chatting with a group of people. "Well, I'm glad he did," Sophie said. "Sometimes we need a little push." Something about her openness caught him off guard. They spent the next hour talking. She was involved with the charity, hosting the event, passionate about helping underprivileged children. Her words flowed easily, and for the first time in a long while, Mason listened. Really listened. When the event ended, she gave him her number. Days turned into weeks, and Mason found himself thinking about Sophie more often than he cared to admit. He called her, and they met for coffee. One coffee turned into dinners, long walks in the park, and late-night conversations. She was different, open, compassionate, and genuinely interested in who he was. She asked about his past, but never pried, allowing him to share what he was ready to reveal. One evening, as they walked along the riverbank, Mason stopped and stared at the water. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. His voice was heavy. Sophie turned to him, concern in her eyes. "Okay." He told her everything. The betrayal, the revenge, the destruction he'd orchestrated. As he spoke, his voice wavered, and he felt exposed in a way he hadn't before. When he finished, there was silence. "You went through hell," she said softly. "But you don't have to stay there." Mason looked at her, searching for judgment, disgust, anything that would confirm his fears. But all he saw was understanding. "How can you say that? I'm not the man you think I am." "No," Sophie agreed. "You're better than you were. You chose to open up instead of hiding. That matters." Her words sank in slowly, but they stayed with him. Over the next few months, Mason focused on rebuilding not just his professional life, but his personal one. He reconnected with old friends, apologized where it was needed, and let go of the bitterness that had once consumed him. It wasn't easy. The ghosts of betrayal still lingered, but they no longer controlled him. Catalina reached out again, this time through a letter. "I hope you're finding peace," she wrote. "I'm trying to. I've hurt so many people, including myself. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I'm truly sorry." Mason read the letter several times before placing it in a drawer. He didn't respond. Forgiveness was a complicated thing, and while he wasn't sure he could offer it, he chose not to hold on to the anger. It was the first step toward letting go. Sophie stood by him through it all. She encouraged him, challenged him, and reminded him that life could be good again. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Mason turned to her. "I never thought I'd find this again," he admitted. "Find what?" she asked, leaning closer. "Hope," he said simply. She took his hand in hers. "It's always there. Sometimes you just need to look harder." In time, Mason realized that his story wasn't defined by betrayal or revenge. It was defined by his choice to move forward, to find strength in vulnerability, and to open his heart again. Sophie became a beacon of light in his darkest moments, and together, they carved out a new path, one built on trust, respect, and genuine love. For the first time in a long while, Mason smiled a real, genuine smile. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer crushed him. He had found something worth living for, a chance at new beginnings. Damien woke to the blaring sound of sirens outside his window, a sound that had become all too familiar. His once luxurious penthouse had been replaced by a cramped, dingy apartment in a rundown part of the city. The walls were thin. He could hear neighbors arguing through them. The paint peeled, and the air was perpetually stale. He stared at the ceiling, memories of his past life flashing before his eyes, the power, the wealth, the women who fawned over him. Now, he was just another broken man, forgotten and despised. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Damien called a raspy voice. It was Frank, his former business associate turned reluctant landlord. "Rent's late again. You know the deal." Damien dragged himself to the door, his face hollow and unshaven. "I'll have it," he muttered. Frank shook his head. "You've been saying that for weeks." He leaned closer, his voice low. "You screwed a lot of people over, Damien. You're lucky I even let you stay here." As Frank left, Damien closed the door, leaning against it. He was trapped, his past sins coiled around him like chains. He reached for the bottle of cheap whiskey on the counter and poured a glass, his hands shaking. This was his life now, broken promises, regrets, and the knowledge that he had destroyed himself. On the other side of town, Catalina walked through the aisles of a grocery store. Every step felt heavy, every glance from strangers a reminder of her disgrace. She reached for a carton of milk, only to see an older woman give her a scornful look before walking away. The humiliation never ended. At the checkout counter, the cashier, a young man barely out of his teens, hesitated before ringing up her items. "Catalina, right?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Yes," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "I thought so," he said, the judgment clear in his eyes. "Saw some stuff about you online." She forced herself to endure it, to keep her composure. Once outside, she sat on a bench, the weight of her shame pressing down on her. She tried to find work, but no one would hire her. Old friends no longer took her calls. Even her family had distanced themselves. She was alone, and the isolation was suffocating. One day, in a desperate attempt to find some semblance of connection, she reached out to Mason. She dialed his number with trembling hands, but the call went straight to voicemail. "Mason, it's me," she began, her voice cracking. "I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I'm sorry. For everything. I wanted you to know." She hung up, knowing deep down that he wouldn't call back. Mason listened to the voicemail once before deleting it. He sat in his living room, the weight of the past finally feeling like a distant memory. Sophie entered the room, her eyes warm and understanding. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "Better than I've been in a long time." "Want to take a walk?" she suggested. "It's a beautiful day." Mason nodded. They walked hand in hand through the city streets, the crisp air filling their lungs. As they turned a corner, they saw them, Damien and Catalina. It was almost surreal, like ghosts from another life. Damien sat hunched on a park bench, a shadow of the arrogant man he once was. Catalina walked past, eyes downcast, clutching a worn-out bag. For a brief moment, Mason's eyes met Catalina's. There was no hatred in his gaze, no anger, just a calm indifference. Catalina's eyes pleaded with him, searching for recognition, for forgiveness. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words died on her lips. Mason turned away, his grip on Sophie's hand tightening. He kept walking. "You knew them, didn't you?" Sophie asked softly. "Yes," Mason replied, the weight of his past slipping further away with every step. "But they're just people I used to know." The taste of revenge had been bitter. It had consumed him, driven him to the edge, and nearly destroyed him. But standing beside Sophie, feeling the warmth of her presence, Mason realized that he had found something far more meaningful. The sweetness of moving on, of building a new life filled with hope, love, and second chances, lingered far longer. They walked past a group of children playing in the park. One of them kicked a soccer ball too hard, sending it rolling toward Mason. He picked it up and tossed it back with a smile. The boy grinned and waved before running off to join his friends. "Life keeps moving," Sophie said, her eyes on the children. "Yes, it does," Mason agreed. He paused, taking in the moment, the laughter, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the feel of Sophie's hand in his. For so long, he'd been trapped by the past, but now he saw a path forward, a path he was ready to walk. He turned to Sophie. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For being here. For believing in me." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "You did the hard part, Mason. You chose to move on." They continued walking, their steps in sync. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mason allowed himself to hope. He wasn't defined by betrayal or revenge. He was more than the man who had been hurt. He was the man who had survived and learned to live again. As they walked away, the past faded behind them, replaced by the promise of something new and unbreakable.